Today, the merits of MMT. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today I'm joined by Stephen Hale. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Martin.
Thank you very much for spending some time with us. And you hail from the University of Adelaide.
That's right, yeah. I've been at the University of Adelaide for 17 years now. Prior to that, I used to be in the UK. I used to train bankers and other financial service professionals in the UK. I didn't mainly work in universities over there, but for nearly 20 years now, I've been in the university sector.
Okay, and you're in the economics department, is that right?
That's right. I'm a teaching specialist in the School of Economics, and perhaps not surprisingly, given my background, I mainly teach on banking and finance courses and a little bit of macroeconomics as well.
Excellent. Well, okay. Well, I appreciate your time today. And I think it's a really important time to have a conversation around some of the economic stuff that's swashing around at the moment. I'm interested in specifically, for example, in the US, there's quite a lot of interest, Bernie Sanders around MMT and those sorts of things. And clearly there are some interesting challenges even locally in Australia with regards to the way that the economy is currently ticking along or not, depending on who you talk to. So I think it'll be really good to have a bit of a conversation around your perspectives with regards to some of those economic issues and perhaps touch specifically on MMT and what it is and how it might work.
Well, as far as the local economic issues are concerned, the biggest risk to the Australian economy is Australian politicians on both sides of the divide, and particularly the budget surplus fetish that they have at the moment. They both sides have bought in to, encouraged by the sort of economists that Stephen Keen, who I've seen you interview recently, and I won't say we don't have respect for, but we don't have the same perspective on how the economy works as they do. They both talk as though the Australian government is a household, as though it has to earn income through taxation before it can spend, or if the government spends more than it's raising in taxes and other receipts, as has been the case in recent years, they talk as though that means they're going to have to raise more taxes in the future and so put a burden on future generations, or cut spending in the future in order to repay that debt at some point in the future. Whereas the Australian government, and any government with a monetary system similar to ours, is not in that position at all. The Australian government is a currency issuer, not like you and me. We're currency users. We have to get money before we spend it. And as I said, if we spend more than we earn, we either have to spend out of our savings or we accumulate debt, as households have been doing very rapidly over the last 20 years. Which we have to service if we're not going to become insolvent in the future. With a currency issuer like the Australian government, it's kind of the other way around. They spend new money into circulation. They don't have to gather in taxation before they spend. Some of what they spend into circulation, they tax back out of circulation again. And for 35 years now in Australia, it's been the practice that the gap between what they spend and what they tax back out of circulation they absorb through issuing debt securities.
So this is a really important perspective, because what you're actually saying is this whole quest to wipe out debt completely is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the way the economy actually works, because it's not like a household budget where you've got to effectively balance it out eventually. A government and their budgets have a completely different set of parameters around them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
And the Australian government's debt is just those dollars that the Australian government down the years has spent into circulation that they've not yet taxed back out of circulation.
Okay.
Again, the government can create money through net spending. The only other significant way that money is created in our economy is through the creation of additional private debt.
Okay.
Now, that private debt is a burden on the people who take it out in the future, and that's the problem that we've come to in Australia at the moment. The Howard Costello surpluses, and also much of the rest of the time, the insufficient level of deficit spending in Australia means we now have, as I'm sure you're aware, the world's second highest household debt to disposable income ratio. We've got to a point where households are loath to take on very much more debt, so credit growth is falling. And actually, in a way, that's a good thing, because if we were to see the debt to income ratio go up further than it's gone up already, then the eventual correction in the Australian economy would be somewhat more severe than we might be faced with anyway. So at the moment, in order for private sector balance sheets to become more secure without our economy going through a recession, or at least continuing in the doldrums, which is where it is at the moment, both sides of politics, it shouldn't be a left-right thing. How they go about it would be different. Of course, they'd have different priorities. But both sides of politics should be explaining to people that the government budget should be somewhere between 2 to 3% in deficit in the foreseeable future. And that isn't building up a debt which has to be repaid in the future. It's simply the government increasing the net money supply because it's appropriate for the government to do that.
Okay. So what you're really saying then is that the focus on keeping the debt down is putting more pressure on the private sector. And one of the reasons why private debt is, considerably higher than perhaps it was is because of all those mortgages and those sorts of things. But if in fact the government was able to increase the amount of debt in the system, it can take some of the pressure off and invest in some of the things that, government should be investing in.
Absolutely. It's not the role of the government to run a surplus. Modern monetary theory, which you asked me about at the beginning, says that if you are a monetary sovereign, and to be a monetary sovereign, you have to issue your own currency. So Spain and Greece are not monetary sovereigns. You also have to have a floating exchange rate, so you don't commit to exchange your currency for anything else which you could run out of. And you have to have no significant foreign currency denominated debt. Now, that's true. It's true in the US, it's true in Canada, it's true in Japan, it's true in the UK, it's true in New Zealand, it's true in Australia. That's a list of countries that are full monetary sovereigns. Now, if you're a monetary sovereign, the constraint on government spending and the constraint on all spending in the economy is the productive capacity of the economy. So, of course, if the government spends too much, if total spending in the economy grows too quickly and outstrips supply, then inflationary pressures are going to build up. Businesses will be operating near full capacity. There'll be shortages of various skills, and that will put upward pressure on the inflation rate. We are 1,000 kilometres away from that at the moment. That's not currently the risk. That's the only constraint on the government. The government has no purely financial constraint. So when, for example, I've heard Chris Bowen recently say that a Labour government would want fiscal surpluses of about 1% of GDP so that they had a buffer that they could spend in the event of an economic downturn, that's complete nonsense. It's meaningless. There is no limit to the ability of the Australian government to net spend when it's appropriate to do so. And you can't interpret a particular budget balance as being a good thing or a bad thing outside the context of the economy. But what is true in our financial system, and in any financial system, is that surpluses and deficits have to cancel out, or to put the same thing another way, for every net lender, there's a net borrower. And if the coalition and the ALP, or I should say all the ALP, are successful in managing to engineer a fiscal surplus in the next year or two, that means somebody else, by definition, is in deficit. Now, it's extremely unlikely that it will be the rest of the world which is in deficit, because even with very high commodity prices and a trade surplus, Australia as a whole, still has a current account deficit, which is another way of saying the rest of the world is net lending on our financial system, as it has been doing continuously since 1974. That's unlikely to reverse. It certainly won't reverse significantly in the foreseeable future. We desperately need our private sector to be running financial surpluses, because that's going to be part of creating healthier private sector balance sheets and household balance sheets. We can't rely on additional household debt and a booming property market to support our economy in the next few years. That simply isn't going to happen. So, bearing in mind that in order for households to run a surplus or to net save, and for the rest of the world to net save in Australian dollars, which is what it's been doing for a long time, and so what it will probably continue to do in the near future. The Australian government has to run a fiscal deficit. Now, you either run a planned fiscal deficit, which is high enough to support demand in the economy while the private sector meets its net savings desires and will hold the economy close to full employment and will mitigate the effects of falling property prices over time. Or you try and run a surplus. By trying to run a surplus, you don't net spend enough initially, and the economy goes into recession, and as a consequence, your tax receipts crash, unemployment starts edging up again, so New Start and other payments increase too, but mainly it's the tax receipts crashing that would have this effect, in which case you end up with a deficit anyway, but a deficit that you promised you wouldn't have. And if you're the new ALP government, you then have the coalition blaming you for crashing the economy and running a deficit when you said you were going to run a surplus. I think there's a really good chance that the Labour Party will win this election, that the Australian economy will flirt with or go into recession sometime next year, if not before, that they'll end up having to run quite a significant budget deficit in order to, well, just the automatic stabilisers in the economy will push the budget towards deficit then. And then, of course, the coalition and the media will turn around and say, well, look, you promised you were going to have a surplus. You had a deficit. The economy's in recession. It's your deficit that's driven the recession, or something like that. Some ridiculous logic will get used. And then we end up, I don't know, maybe we won't end up with Tony Abbott as Prime Minister again, but they'll end up with a coalition government again, which I'm sure is not what the ALP want to achieve. That's a possible scenario for the next couple of years. And it's no better if the coalition win, because the coalition say exactly the same thing as far as the budget balance is concerned as the Australian Labour Party. If the Australian coalition understood the monetary system as well, I'm going to shock people here, as Donald Trump appears to, then they'd be running a fiscal deficit and there'd be tax cuts. And the economy would be doing better as a result. And sure, they'd have a higher net debt to GDP ratio, but even if you are an orthodox economist, Australia's net debt to GDP ratio is less than 20%. And it's way below, it's below the OECD, it's about half the OECD average, and it's about half Germany's government's net debt to GDP ratio. It's about a quarter of that in countries like the UK and the US, and I think Japan's got about 6 times as much debt as us. And the country with the fragile financial system is not Japan. The Japanese government is never going to default on its debt. Nearly half of it is owned by the Bank of Japan now anyway, so isn't even out there in the private sector. The country with the fragile financial system, as I'm sure Stephen King would have explained before, is Australia. And it's that household debt. And our banks may well be meeting their capital adequacy requirements as laid down by APRA, interpreting the Bank for International Settlements rules. But if there was a property crash, those capital reserves would be wiped out.
So there's an interesting sort of set of questions that come from that. So the first, I guess, is that if the public debt does grow, then the interest on that debt is going to have to be paid. And presumably that's sensitive to the size of the debt and also the interest rates in the system at the moment. And I guess globally interest rates are very low. But would that scenario change if interest rates started to rise?
Well, first of all, interest payments on the government debt are, well, like any government spending, are new money. They're mildly stimulative as far as economic activity is concerned. So there's an inflation risk, but they can't force the Australian government into insolvency. The Australian government does not issue debt because it needs to in the first place. Since 1982, as I mentioned before, they have issued debt securities to cancel out their net spending. But the reason for this is that when the government spends more than it taxes, it increases the exchange settlement reserves held by Australian deposit takers at the RBA. And if those reserves were not withdrawn through the issuance of government debt, then the RBA would have to engage in much larger scale transactions on the money market than it does at the moment. So even when they moved to the current system in 1982, the Reserve Bank explained that the introduction of an auction system for government debt securities was to do with managing interest rates in Australia and the Reserve Bank keeping control of the cash rate, and was not because the government needs to issue those securities in order to finance itself. If you're going to issue those securities, what does the yield on those securities depend on? It depends on the current cash rate and on the market's expectations of what the cash rate will be on average over the next few years. And at the moment, of course, the yield curve in Australia is flat because nobody's expecting significant inflation, so nobody's expecting the cash rate to rise very much out into the indefinite future, really 10 years into the future. But the cash rate is a policy rate. And in countries which have engaged in quantitative easing, and particularly in Japan, what they've shown, which, I mean, if you understand the monetary system as you do, you've known this already, if they want to use their balance sheet to do this, the central bank can control the whole pure yield curve. They can control the yield to maturity on government debt out to 10 years and beyond. So the Bank of Japan has, in the last couple of years, set the interest rate on 10-year Japanese government debt at zero. Quite deliberately. They just bought sufficient of those bonds every month to drive the prices up to the level where the yield to maturity on them is zero. Having said that, the rate of interest, in other words, is a policy rate that the central bank sets. They can control the yield curve right the way across the whole length of the yield curve if they want. In terms of the debt to GDP ratio being explosive and rising out of control, that's not got anything to do directly with the borrowing by the government for the purpose of spending. So the pure fiscal deficit. It's to do with the relationship between the rate of interest on government debt and the rate of growth in GDP over time. So even if you start with a low level of government debt, if you were to balance your budget, excluding interest payments, if the rate of interest on government debt was above the rate of growth of nominal gross domestic product, then over time the government debt to GDP ratio would rise. That's not going to make the government insolvent. I actually would prefer it if we didn't refer to Treasury bonds as government debt securities at all. If they were reclassified as transferable term deposits at the RBA, that's what they are. If the government net spends and does not withdraw that cash from the banking system, then what that creates is exchange settlement reserves, which are a deposit that the private sector has with the RBA. Well, that's an interest-bearing liability for the government sector, including the RBA, because they pay interest on exchange settlement account balances. If you issue government debt securities, you're issuing another government liability that again the government pays interest on, which it's not a current account. It's not a transaction account at the RBA, which is what exchange settlement balances are, but it is a term deposit at the RBA. It's a highly liquid asset. There really isn't that much difference between government debt securities and reserves held by the private banks at the Reserve Bank of Australia. The difference is in framing. Nobody thinks the RBA will run out on money. People think, because they equate government bonds with corporate bonds, that if the debt ratio rises too far, just like you'd worry if the debt to equity ratio of business rose too far, that somehow the government's going to become insolvent. That can't happen. If the government net spends too much, if over time the net money supply increases too much, that's my term for the government's net debt, then that could potentially be inflationary. Well, that's the time, if there is too much spending in the economy, it is inflationary, that's the time when you need to have austerity, when you need to cut back on government spending or potentially raise taxes. But we're back to the beginning, really. I didn't say that there's no constraint on government spending. I said the constraint is an inflation constraint. I said that's not significant at the moment. If it ever should become significant, then if inflation starts to rise above the 2 to 3% target that the Reserve Bank's failed to meet on the low side for 4 of the last 5 years, then you need to cut spending, you need to raise taxes, you might even need to increase interest rates, although we seem now to be in a situation around the world where increases in interest rates, for example, in the US, don't have much of an impact on economic activity. So monetary policy simply doesn't seem to work anymore. That wouldn't be what I would recommend. You've got macro-prudential policy as well. You can tighten up on banking regulation if spending is growing too quickly and it's coming from the private sector. It depends what you think the cause of inflation is. But it's inflation that's the barrier. It's not government solvency.
Okay, very interesting. And I guess what you're really saying then is that the critical question should not be, are we in deficit or not? But it's essentially, what benefit is there to running those deficits and basically investing in the things that actually, everybody knows we need. And so it becomes a question about the public benefit and the economic benefit that can be created by doing it.
Absolutely. And at the moment, there isn't enough spending going on in Australia.
Yep.
We've got over 13% underutilisation. I know the official unemployment rate is only 5%, but that's becoming increasingly not the right statistic to look at when you're thinking about excess capacity in the economy. We've got youth underutilisation of people between the ages of 15 and 24, which is about 30%. There are many, many people who are in insecure employment. There are people in mortgage stress. We don't have significant upward pressure on wage rates. Inequality increased from the mid-70s until about 2010 and has levelled off now, but at a very high level. All these are issues that we need to address. And of course, the government has many things it should be investing in, particularly changing the way we generate our electricity, shifting transportation towards the use of electricity away from fossil fuels, and all sorts of other issues to do with climate change. There are many things we should be investing in. At the moment, it would be appropriate to, one way or another, move from a budget balance which is close to zero right now to planning to have a fiscal deficit of 2 to 3% of GDP. That means if you weren't going to change the tax system, it means you're going to be planning for maybe $45 or $50 billion of additional spending within the next year or two per annum, which is 10 times the impact on the government budget as the planned change in the rules on franking credits. For example, that seems small beer. If the Labour Party throws away the election as a result of that change, they will have thrown away the election based on something which is a relatively minor issue as far as the budget is concerned. They should be making the case for deficit spending and talking about the government deficit being a non-government surplus. In terms of, over time, then setting the government balance at the appropriate level, given how our economy performs, then people like me believe in having a job guarantee scheme. We believe in eliminating involuntary unemployment, moving away from using unemployment as a means to discipline demands in the labour market, to keep wage costs under control, to keep inflation down, which is how we've done it in the past. And instead of having a buffer stock of unemployed people in the economy, we believe that we should be offering them the opportunity to participate in a job guarantee scheme, working on things like environmental repair, small infrastructure projects, additional help to allow the elderly to remain independent and in their homes, activities currently done by volunteers, optional training. The Greens have come out with an income guarantee for artists recently. Well, we'd have a job guarantee that would allow people to work in the arts as part of it, as they did in the New Deal in the 1930s. And the idea with the job guarantee is if inflation is picking up in the economy and you need to slow down demand and people lose their jobs, some people as a consequence of that, they don't go into unemployment. They don't end up dependent on New Start, which you can't live on. It's such a ridiculously low level. It hasn't been increased in real terms for 20 odd years. Instead, they get the opportunity to work in a job guarantee, earning the legal minimum wage, which is set high enough so that for most people they'll be kept out of poverty based on working in the job guarantee scheme. They'll remain more employable than they otherwise would have been. We'll have a range of public services that we don't have at the moment. And spending on the job guarantee will automatically expand during an economic downturn to improve the way in which the fiscal balance works as an automatic stabiliser, to cushion the economy from a downturn. And then when the economy booms and when the private sector and the non-job guarantee part of the economy creates more better paying jobs, then spending on the job guarantee will automatically, without anybody fine-tuning anything, because you've built in activities which is scalable, at least some of the activities in the job guarantee are scalable, the spending on the job guarantee will shrink. And so when the government budget needs to move towards a smaller deficit or maybe even a surplus, this will happen automatically, more so than it does at the moment, if we have an effective job guarantee in place. The job guarantee should allow us to spend the right amount in the right places so that we keep our regional centres healthy. People still have the opportunity to stay living outside the capital cities, and they're going to have worthwhile jobs. They're not going to be forced into poverty if they do that. You're spending the right amount at the right time in the right places on the right people. And you've got a more effective counter-cyclical measure instead of just relying on tax receipts rising and falling or spending on New Start and other welfare payments going up or down. You're keeping people out of poverty. 2/3 of those people who are officially unemployed are living in what we regard as relative poverty. That's also true of those who are involuntarily underemployed. We could scrap that. This would cost at the moment, we think, if you want to think about the cost at all, because it's an appropriate cost, this would push the government budget on its own, maybe 1.5% towards a fiscal deficit. At the moment, I think the fiscal deficit should be bigger than that. So I think there is room for additional government investment in the economy. Or if you're in the coalition, there's room for tax cuts. But you shouldn't be worrying about trying to run a budget surplus. You probably won't manage it anyway. You'll just push the economy towards a recession if you try. That's what we think.
Very interesting. And my last question, Stephen, is this concept, the MMT concept, getting any traction anywhere in the political conversation in Australia, or is it really?
Very much so.
Okay, right.
Very much so. It's bottom up in the ALP. In other words, there's enormous interest amongst the members and some of their backbenchers, but at the moment, the front bench of the ALP are terrified if people describe them as being irresponsible. They have been talking about the government as though it's a household for so many years. It's very difficult for them to turn around and change their mind. As far as the job guarantee is concerned, we've had people like Wayne Swan come out and say basically they think that's an interesting idea. I believe, I'm probably not even supposed to say this, but I'm going to risk saying this amount, I believe the Australian Greens are about to come out with a job guarantee proposal, or at least a trial for a job guarantee. In fact, I'm sure that's the case, because there was a survey done by GetUp, which has been published now, where the Australian Greens have agreed to commit to a trial job guarantee program and a target for the official unemployment rate of at most 3%, which you're not going to get to unless you have a job guarantee in place. There are other groups of people, including professional economists in policy institutions, that I personally have spoken to, that I'm not allowed to say that I've spoken to. But there is interest here, and there could be even more interest. Of course, I think there's maybe a 40% chance Bernie Sanders will become the Democratic nomination. He's the second favourite at the moment, but I think there's quite a good chance the favourite might fall over at some point over the next year. And if it was Bernie Sanders against Donald Trump, there'd be, despite the relative strength of the US economy, if that continues, I think there'd be something close to a 50-50 chance either of them could win the presidential election. If that should happen, then there will be a modern monetary theorist as the Treasury Secretary, or at least as the Deputy Treasury Secretary in the US, and that might be Stephanie Kelton, who is Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor, who is visiting our university actually either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, and I hope the ABC, people that run the Q&A program will put her on Q&A. Certainly Australia's political leaders will want to speak to her in private, if not in public, and we'll get a lot of publicity if she comes back. She visited briefly last year. Get Up brought her over, and she did some talks in Brisbane and Melbourne and Sydney. She was on the ABC Breakfast program and Planet America and a few other places. I hope we'll get more publicity next time around. And what particularly is going to move the whole discourse in Australia in our direction is if whichever party comes to power after this particular federal election, if as a consequence of inappropriate fiscal policy, they drive our economy into recession and they turn the downturn in the property market into something more severe.
Stephen, it's very interesting talking to you, and I really appreciate your perspective, and I can see the power and the merit of your arguments. And it's very interesting, isn't it? There is a polarization between the no debt camp, as it were, and debt's the problem, and the MMT guys who say no, debt isn't the problem. There's a whole nother narrative that needs to be understood, and I think you've articulated that other narrative extremely well today. So I really
where we agree with Steve Keen is that debt is the problem, but it's household debt.
Yes. It's what you do, and if you can, as we said at the beginning, if you can take some of the pressure off the household sector by essentially, using public debt appropriately, then the formulation can change quite significantly. I think it's a really interesting argument and point of difference between those two camps, as it were. And it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next little while. As you say, I think the outcome of the election will be quite significant.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not necessarily a good election to win.
Indeed. Stephen, thank you very much for your time. And maybe we can circle back and catch up again down the track a bit.
Absolutely, Martin. It's a pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, there you have it. A really interesting conversation from Stephen there. And I think he makes some interesting points. Are we looking at this the wrong way? Is debt, particularly public debt, really the problem? Are there alternative paths that could be pursued? Perhaps our political class is actually leading us into a blind alley. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.